So the idea here is to talk about redraft strategy. So we're not necessarily going to focus on players as much. It's just how do you attack a draft when you're going into it. So let's start off with a very vanilla, generic, I think what most people would say, a standard draft. One quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 receivers, tight end, maybe 1 flex, and that's all. We're not going to worry about kickers and defenses. That's for somebody else. So we'll just go down the line. Ricky, if you want to start. How do you approach a 12-team draft? And does it matter? To me, it matters. There's a whole different draft strategy when I'm going against my home buddies versus going against the top people in the country in King's Classic. Big difference. And the weird thing is that the big difference is that the experts are more predictable than the home people. I could go into an expert draft, literally, I would say close my eyes, and I kind of know because they're kind of ADP, there's a plus or minus of ADP wise, but I kind of know if I'm going to get a guy, I need to do it here because by the time it comes back around, I know this group. But home leagues to me are a circus. You don't know who's going to pick what. Quarterback could go in the first 3 picks. Yeah, and so talk about how you go into a draft strategy. What do you think about, what is your thought process going into that draft? How do you prepare for that in just a regular league? And you can talk about home versus, but kind of talk about that, Ricky. We'll just go down the line from there.
Well, one of the big things Bob hit on is if you know your competitors, you've been in the league with them for so long, take advantage of that fact, okay? That is one of the most important things. I find that in home leagues, to Bob's point, that quarterbacks go much earlier than in like some of the expert leagues that we do. So particularly in offense-only leagues, where there's plenty of quarterbacks, take advantage, grab the running backs and wide receivers early, let the quarterbacks fall. Maybe sneak in one of the top 5 tight ends this year in particular, but otherwise take advantage of what you know. When you're getting into more of these expert leagues, and for those that might be playing on some of the bigger websites and trying to win $100,000 or $1 million, something like that, never assume that the player you want is going to fall to the next round. There's too many smart sharks out there. So if there's a player you want and you think, oh, I know it, I'm the only one that knows he's going to be a breakout candidate, do not wait. Grab your player. So that's a couple of starting points there.
So a story I like to tell, my home league is about 4 years ago, and one of the people in our home league, she took Justin Tucker in the 3rd round, and the Commanders' defense in the 6th round. She won our league, and it wasn't even close. She decimated people, and that's, I think, as analysts, we get so trapped in it, like, this is how it works, this is what you should be doing. But really, to Bob's point, when you get into these home leagues and you're just drafting with people who don't do 20 leagues like we do, it's a completely different world. So from that perspective, just know your league mates. The most important thing you can do is know your league mates, know how they're going to draft. If you've got that person who's going to take a kicker in the 3rd round, just know that they're there and know that they're not a threat to you getting whoever you want in the 3rd or 4th round, and be fluid. Know your league mates, be fluid, and understand that, yeah, things get a little nuts, especially when it comes to redraft. Dynasty's a little bit more predictable. You have more seasoned managers. When you get to redraft, it just gets crazy. And be ready to pivot in a moment's notice to something that you never thought you would do in a million years.
I think specifically looking at like home leagues versus sharp or I guess industry drafts, we all know quarterbacks are going to go a little bit later, so throw ADP out the window. But I think the bigger thing for when you're getting ready for your drafts, don't walk in with any certain set strategy. Let the draft come to you. So depending on where you're drafting from, you're obviously going to be using your queue and earmarking players and stuff like that, but be willing to pivot. So I never walk into a certain draft saying, I'm going to go 0 RB, but if the board falls to me, I can. If the board is giving me value with top running backs, quarterbacks, who's slipping, I'm willing to be liquid and adjust on the fly, like not walking into it saying, I will get a premium tight end, although that's what I'm doing in a lot of leagues this year, or I'm going to go wide receiver heavy or running back heavy. You have to be willing to adjust to the room that you're in. And if you're doing that, you're going to build the best squad that you possibly can instead of trying to say, I'm going to get a top tight end, and then you miss the run and you're overdrafting one of the middle tier guys instead of taking a better wide receiver or running back.
And to add to that, I think that was a good prelude to what I'm going to get into here, and just you're going to hear a lot about tier-based drafting, and it's important that you're either at the top of the tier or at the bottom of the tier, because you want to be starting these runs when they're happening. You're going to hear a lot about runs happening in fantasy football, and if you can be at the start of a run, at the end of the run, it's the most advantageous, I find. If you can be zigging while the other guys are zagging, it's an important tool, because that's what's going to differentiate your team. And when you come into these drafts, like Debro said, you know, you kind of have a plan, but your plan's going to get out the window because you know people are going to be throwing wrenches into that plan. So you got to be that chameleon. And if you go into these drafts with a tier base, then you kind of have an idea when they break. And it's an important thing to be on top of.
So first of all, it's hard to follow 4 other guys and come up with something unique. But essentially, my plan is to not have a plan. So I go into the draft, and I've only been playing kind of competitively in fantasy football for a little while, and I mostly in redraft play public leagues, so I don't know the people that I'm drafting with. I come from the baseball space, and if anybody has seen or read the book Moneyball, there's the idea of market inefficiency. So whatever the market, which is your draft room, is showing, I try and, like he said, zigging when other people are zagging. I basically read the room, and if running backs are going, I start hitting wide receivers really hard. Whatever the trend is in the draft room, I do the opposite of that to find the best values that I can. And you know, when you're playing on ESPN and it's single point PPR, you're playing on Yahoo and it's half point PPR, you just need to know what you're doing, and then typically wait on quarterbacks to fall because that's where the value is. And then your last 5 draft picks, don't be afraid to take reaches, and also know that you're going to be able to drop those guys. Don't take people that you're in love with your last 5 or 6 picks. Be willing to drop them for waiver wire pickups and everything. And that's essentially what I enter every draft with. Just look for the market inefficiencies and don't fall in love with players towards the end of the draft.
So the first real simple one, and most of you know this, do not, and I repeat, do not draft with your heart for your favorite football team. I don't care if you're a Chiefs fan or a Browns fan or a Steelers fan. If you draft a player because that is the right player to draft, not because you're a Browns fan and you only have 6 of them on your team. Doesn't always work out real well. But I think most importantly to me for what we're talking about here is when you're going into those drafts, go into them with the mindset that within the first 8 picks, you're going to want to have your starting lineup. One of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of people make is they're like, I'm going to go 0 RB, so I'm going to draft 7 straight wide receivers. That's great, but guess what? Then your garbage quarterbacks, garbage running backs, you might get lucky. You might find a diamond in the rough. But then what happens is now you have too many wide receivers, and you think, oh, everybody's going to beg me to trade for them. They won't. They know what they did to you in that draft. They probably sniped a bunch of your wide receivers because you didn't think they were going to draft another one. So just watch that. Be careful when you go through that process. So, all right. So let's go back. We're going to go back the other way now. Let's talk about. I literally just want to break it. I had it. I really did. Let me think. Oh, we were talking about tiers. So, anybody, put your hand up if you know like what tiers are in fantasy football when you're drafting. Okay, maybe we don't have to talk about that. Yeah, because you guys obviously know that. So I guess what we want to focus on next is roster construction. Okay, so again, if you got just that simple 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 receivers, 1 tight end, how do you build it? Like I said, I want to have my starting lineup by the end of the 8th round. I want to have those spots filled. Now, of course, I'm going to fill them with very consistent players because that's my niche. Because then I know when I go back into rounds 9 and up, I can take those flyers that might pay off for me if one of the other ones underperform. So that's kind of my way of roster construction, is getting that starting lineup set first, then filling in with maybe some high upside, lower floor kind of people. So, okay.
So as far as roster construction, again, playing in public leagues. So playing in public leagues, as far as roster construction goes, a lot of times I don't know my draft slot until the draft room gets made. So depending on where I'm at, wide receivers tend to be taken a lot in the first round. So if I'm towards the back end, my roster construction is going to start with running backs, and I'm going to fill out wide receivers a little bit later. There is so much value in later rounds with quarterbacks. You can find guys like Trevor Lawrence or Dak Prescott or Jared Goff who are going to be league winners in the 9th and 10th rounds. So essentially, you focus on optimizing your point value per game, and that's where you're going to find your running backs in a hero RB situation. If you're at the back end of the draft, you're drafting Breece Hall and trying to pair him up with a Travis Etienne or a Bijan Robinson or somebody who's got a ton of upside and who's going to be giving you a lot of fantasy points per game. Wide receivers are typically in PPR leagues, they're the highest scorers per game, but there's also a lot of them and fewer running backs. And zero RB has become kind of the trend in the industry. So people are taking the wide receivers early. So those running backs are available to you. And again, if you're fluid in your draft strategy and you're playing the market inefficiency and everybody's taking wide receivers, you start stacking running backs. If people are taking running backs early, then you start stacking those top-end wide receivers and letting everything else fall and grabbing the value late.
So in addition to that, Biggs mentioned some things, like a simple word there, like league winners. We hear this often, okay? The first, 10, 12 rounds of a draft, it's pretty standard, You're going to see the same people fall on the same, rows, essentially. And when you get into these later rounds, for me, I'll construct my team having to fill a roster, like Bob mentioned, with guys that are stability. And then when I'm looking in the later rounds, I'm looking for these league winners. I don't know, you might have heard of a guy named Debra who, he almost discovered Puka Nakua last year, and we're talking about a league winner, okay? We're talking about a guy like Kyron Williams, who last year was found in the later rounds. You're looking for guys that are high upside plays that could win your league, because that's what's going to differentiate your team from the other ones. Is in those later rounds, I'm looking at these high upside plays that could fall into that category. Guys for me this year, a Javon Baker is falling into that category. He's got a lot of opportunity, and I'm looking at somebody that can fall into that category where they're going to catapult my team to the next level, because I have that stability in the first build of my rounds where I know I'm going to get those points. Now I'm looking for a guy that can be, my wide receiver 3 putting up wide receiver 1 or 2 numbers on average, and that's what's going to elevate your team. So those are the dart throws you really want to take later on in those rounds, the high upside plays.
I mean, for me, it depends. There's a lot of context of team building. So when I'm in Discord and I'm asking answering people's questions out there, and I'm like, should I go approaching a team? And some of that boils down to, are you playing in an 18 league? Yes, they're still out there, and everybody sees roster builds and it must be an 18 There's still 18 leagues, but 8 and 10 team leagues. How am I going to approach those versus a 12 team? 8 smaller leagues, I want the onesie positions to be elite. I want them to be difference makers, because you all know, if you're playing in a 10-team league, everybody's starting all-stars. And so it's really, are my all-stars better than yours? So if you get into the onesie positions, those are the ones that can put you over the top. So I'm more likely in those teams to pay up for an Anthony Richardson, somebody that I think of that, or one of the elite tier guys that falls. So the smaller leagues pay for the onesie guys, and then any standard 12 team, 1 QB, 3 wide receivers, it depends on where I'm drafting from and what's going on in the draft. So I'm willing to go, if Bijan or Brees fall to me, take a running back in the first round. I know that is kind of sacrilege nowadays. Or take one in the first 2 rounds if they fall. Or build a wide receiver heavy team. So, I've got certain players I like this year, and I will have more exposure to them across my leagues. But nothing is set in stone. Be willing to pivot in the middle of a draft. I was in my FFPC Pros versus Joe's team. Everybody over there, it was massive wide receiver runs. And instead of chasing the wide receiver runs when I had 2 players around me going 0 wide receiver and they're gobbling up wide receivers, well, if I try to chase that, I'm probably going to be making minus EV draft picks because the better running backs are still left on the board, wide receivers drying up. In that draft, I had to pivot, and in the middle rounds, instead of going a lot of times, I'm picking a lot of wide receivers because I like the wide receivers there, but they were going earlier. So I loaded up on running backs, had a really strong running back draft, and then I just hit high upside rookie wide receivers late. So you have to be willing to pivot depending on how the draft is going. But I'd say at the top, get a rushing quarterback this year. Try to get a top 7 tight end. I think they're going to be difference makers, and there are values. George Kittle, Kyle Pitts, I'm looking at you. And build the best team you can. Be fluid.
So you guys have done a great job with the front end of the draft. So I want to talk a little bit about the back end strategy. I think is where a lot of winning happens. You know what's going to happen in the first 8 to 10 rounds of a draft. You have an idea what players you're going to target. You know what you want to do. And for most managers, that's not going to vary. But when you get to the back end of the drafts, grabbing some of that value, think about years like James Robinson, the year where, if you took him in the 16th, 17th, 18th round of your draft as a flyer, you ended up winning your league because of James Robinson. And it's finding those guys in the back end of the draft. Puka Nakua's, guys I'm looking at this year that I really like. Ray Davis is a guy that you can get super late in drafts where you could have that Jamal Williams touchdown upside. And really getting into those 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 picks at the back end of your draft that a lot of people are just kind of like, I'm going to throw a dart at some guy. Maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. But if you do the research and you find these guys that have the potential in the situation where their opportunity to break out is higher than most, and that's where you win your drafts. Those late rounds, finding those guys, the Ray Davises, the James Robinsons, the Puka Nakuas, that maybe other people aren't considering as much, but the opportunity is there.
Well, for me, roster construction actually starts for me with scoring settings. I look at the scoring settings for each of my league. I actually am geek enough and I do my own projections. And then I start building up my tiers. And I compare my tiers against and the results of what my rankings are versus last year's rankings, final results. And if they're similar, that means I've screwed up. And to quote the great Bob Harris at Football Die Hard, I'm not trying to draft last year's best team. The repeat rates of the positions are very, very different. So quarterbacks, 8 of the top 12 on average repeat year after year. Running backs, only 5 of the top 12 repeat every year. Similar numbers for the top 24. Wide receivers is about 7.5, and tight ends is about 6. So when I have my tiers for this year, and I compare them to last year, if they're looking similar to how last year finished, I'm not going to win this year. The stats and the numbers say it's got to be different. So then I start peeling the onion a little bit, and I start asking myself, okay, who's changed? Who's got different offensive coordinators? Who's got a new head coach? Who moved teams? And I start looking at those things, and instead of looking at the positive side of it, I actually put the negative hat on and say, okay, how could that be a bad thing for that guy versus a good thing? So in one example, I am extremely high on Drake London. I have him as a top 4 wide receiver this year in my rankings. Okay, a lot of people have him higher. I don't know if they have him that high. And the reason is because Zach Robinson coming over the Rams as new offensive coordinator, along with Kirk Cousins coming over as his quarterback and very little other competition. Also have Kyle Pitts very high as well. So that's an example of how don't draft last year's best teams, which a lot of the rankings that are out there focus on, okay, who was top 12 last year, a couple of adjustments and all. Really look at who has the opportunity and go after those folks to have a better year this coming year. And maybe grab them a tidbit earlier than what their ADP is showing right now.
All right, good stuff. All right, so Ricky, we'll start with you, come back towards me. Just real quick, not a long answer. Is there a favorite spot in the first round that you want to draft? 7th, 1st, 12th? Typical draft. Do you have a favorite spot that you like to be in if you had the choice to be at any spot in the first round?
So if I had to pick a spot in the first round, I would want to be picks 1 through 6 if I was forced to pick a spot. Because I think there's about 6 top players that differentiate themselves, and then there's a bit of a drop off to the next tier. Some people say 7, some people say 8, but I want to get one of those top 6, 7, or 8, depending on how you feel about it. But in general, I have one from every spot, and it's really about, someone said it earlier here, let the draft come to you. You did say to keep it short, sorry, I'll stop there. But if you let the draft come to you and draft what's on the board instead of forcing something, you can win in any spot.
I'll keep this really super simple. I like the 12th pick. I like to sit there on the turn. I like to get the 2 picks and then get to kind of see what everyone else is going to do and then go from there. So yeah, give me that back half of the draft.
I'd say probably the 103, because I think this year's very interesting. I think the chalk picks for the top running back and wide receiver right now are still CD Lamb and CMC. But we're talking about there's parity year over year, and looking at if you're expecting last year's wide receiver 1 to repeat, if you're expecting last year's RB1 to repeat, if you look at it year over year over year, that's actually a harder bet that you're asking to happen again than picking a new wide receiver 1 or RB1 for this season, because the guys don't usually repeat that year over year. So the 103, you're able to take whoever is your favorite flavor of this year's RB1, this year's wide receiver 1, whether it's Chase, that's my wide receiver 1, or Tyreek Hill, or who have you. That's the spot I love, because you're still able to get access to whoever probably is your RB1 or wide receiver 1 if they're not CD Lamb or CMC.
Yeah, I agree with this. I like to be kind of right at the end of a tier. So I see this here, there's a huge tier at the start of the draft. So I'm going to wait, because I'm going to wait till maybe the 106, 107, because I can still get whichever guy falls to me. I don't care who it is, because they're going to be giving me similar production. And then I'm going to have the first pick of that next tier on the way back. So I like to start a draft that way. Just knowing year to year it's going to change, right? The tiers are going to change, and it's going to change, weekly if we get an injury happening. So it's just a matter of being on top of your tiers and mock draft. Do as many drafts as you can ahead of time, and from different spots, because it's important that you're an avid drafter and you're good at any spot, because you're going to randomly get a spot, and it's important that you have exposure everywhere and know where these guys are falling, especially if you're keying in on one specific player.
So I'm going to keep hammering market inefficiency, and I like to read the room. So I prefer when my draft spot is on the back end of the draft, because I can see what people are doing. If I do get something in the top of the draft, the first 6 picks, I like that because I am guaranteed to get who I think is my number 1 ranked player. But we all saw last year where the industry was, some people were trying to push Chase above Justin Jefferson, who's the consensus best wide receiver in the NFL. And the people who were pushing Chase wound up, over the course of the season, gaining more fantasy points because of Jefferson's injury. So Jefferson turned out to not be a value, but we know what he can do. When Chase got injured at the end of the season, the people that took Chase were not winning in the playoffs, but the people that held on to Jefferson, they were winning their leagues because he came back. You can only do that in the top half of the draft. In the back end of the draft, you can take the players who are going to eventually be those league winners and not worry about what's going on with the consensus number 1s. So you can see what other people are doing and then base your strategy on that. And as long as you're prepared at that back end, you're going to be able to wipe people out.
I'm a middle of the road guy too. I like to be 6 or 7. Yesterday in our Kings Classic, we have 14 teams, and we got to draw cards, and you get to pick where you want to pick if you have that ability. So I picked 7th, and I like being there in the middle because then I'm guaranteed there's always going to be 12 picks in between my next pick. When you're on the ends, while it's cool to get those back-to-back picks, you almost have to pick that second pick of what's not going to be there 2 rounds from now. That's rough to me. It's like, that's a hell of a prediction to make. Being in the middle, if a run starts, I have a pretty good chance I'm going to still have a chance to get somebody in that tier that I still want. The other way doesn't always work that well. So that's why I kind of like to be in the middle. But as like Ricky said, I can draft from anywhere and feel comfortable that I'm going to win. And that's the kind of confidence that you should have with your redraft strategies is you know you're the smartest person in the room. You just got to prove it over and over, and you will because you're here today mostly. But right now I'm going to come down to the audience. I think what's important is we always like to take about a half hour taking questions from you folks. So if you have any questions, you can just throw it out to the panel, ask anybody specifically. It's certainly fine, but who wants to go first?
Jason Black from Richmond, Virginia. Been playing fantasy for 34 years. First time here at the Expo. Love to come here. This is my mecca right here. So, 14-team league. I play in my main league's a 14-team league. I'd like you guys to touch on that. My son's in it, so he can earmuffs this. So he doesn't hear what these guys have to say. So I'd love to hear what you say about 14-team league.
All right, when do you guys want to go? I'll kick in because I play in a lot of 14-team leagues.
Is it a 1 QB? So for that, it's really, some of it also has to come down to context, like whether it's 2 wide receivers or 3. Okay. So with that, like specifically, you're only having to start 2 wide receivers. So I have no problems trying to find anchors for running back and wide receiver. With only having to start 2 wide receivers, it really frees you up because with a 14-teamer, you know you're going to go deep. You know positions are going to get thinned out fast. So really going BPA because I don't care at the end of the draft. I don't care if I'm a little bit lighter at running back or I'm a little bit heavier wide receiver. I just want to pick the best players that are available at that point and not trying to fill out a starting lineup and saying I have to get an RB2 and a better wide receiver is available because you have those 2 flex spots. So for me, you could go a little bit running back heavy early or earlier somewhere in the middle in the sense that you only have to start the 2 wide receivers. But if you see the run on running backs and wide receivers are falling, then just draft them. So really, again, going back to in that process, you want to get the best players on the board at that time and not be so focused on, okay, I'm afraid running back is going to dry up because it is a 14-teamer. I need to take the last guy out of a tier even if I don't like him. Take the wide receiver if you like him more.
So I don't know how well this is going to go over, but as the number of owners in each league increases, so from 12 to 14 and then even into the 32-team leagues, the more owners there are, I tend to start focusing on one position and drafting as many players from that position as I can, because then that's going to create a need for the other owners to then do what I want them to do. So the more owners there are, the more I try and not spread out my draft. I try and focus on one position and just maximize everything.
So like I said, I play in a lot of 14-team leagues. I think what's most important to me is building the depth after. So again, that starting lineup, get that set up early, but then try to really do a lot of research on those later rounds. Because in a deep league like that, those are the people that make the difference. Those 2 flex players will make or break your team for the year. Because you're going to have this core, but each week that flip of a coin of who's going in flex 1 and flex 2, if you're literally pulling your hair out every week on that decision, that's going to kill you for the year because then you overcoach. That is my number one disaster all the time. We overthink. Oh, this guy's got this matchup, blah, blah, blah. And I've seen 17 different analysis, and all of a sudden you're like, data overload, you're overcoaching. That's where I kind of, again, highlight that consistency model. Find those guys that have that higher floor that you feel a lot more comfortable. So my perfect example from last year is Jacoby Myers. How many knew that he was top 24 in scoring, you probably don't know he's top 30 in top 24 in consistency too, but that's the point. Most people don't. Most people, especially like home leagues, they're not, Jacoby Myers is an afterthought. Finding those kind of people that have a higher floor will help you in those in those flex spots as you go through the season. That's what I always focus. Our Kings Classic is 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 receivers, and 3 flex. In a 14-team league, by week 8, I just want somebody with a heartbeat. I don't even care how many points they score. I just want to make sure they're actually going to walk out on the field and not die on me. That's all I'm after. So yeah, those deep leagues, and especially with 14, that's tough. So who else has a question for the group? Way in the back. Oh, geez, killing me.
Pardon me for not knowing names, but this one's for the gentleman on my left. You mentioned he was higher on Drake London this season. You mentioned that you were higher on Drake London this season. I'm pretty sure we all can admit that Kyle Pitts is definitely in a make or break year. We all saw what Bijan did a year ago, and now you throw Kirk Cousins into the mix. How much pressure is on Drake London to be this wide receiver one, and is that something to take into consideration for fantasy?
Well, these guys are all paid professional athletes, and they're paid very well, and so from that regard, yes, there's going to be a lot of pressure in London. There'll be a lot of pressure on Cousins. There'll be pressure on the new head coach, Morris, and so forth. But I mean, they're pretty professional, so there's pressure on all of them. And to Kyle Pitts and all, over a year and a half removed from his knee surgery, along with Kirk Cousins, he's not listed in many rankings as being a top 5 tight end or whatever. He'd be one of my targets this year.
And I'll add to that, again, going back to the consistency model, he was 75% consistent in an offense that was basically held in shackles by Arthur Smith. Him, Bijan, Pitts are all just ready to explode. If that offense clicks even 50% better than it did last year, we're all in for a really nice season with Atlanta Falcons on our team, that's for sure.
So I wanted to add, somebody spoke earlier about knowing the new environments, what offensive coordinator moved on, what offensive coordinator was brought in, what quarterback came in, that kind of thing. And with the Falcons, it's a very unique situation. You have a carryover from the Sean McVay Rams offense because Zach Robinson is there. So if you look historically at what the Rams have done, they've always supported a couple of wide receivers, a good quarterback, Matt Stafford and Jared Goff being kind of analogs to Kirk Cousins. So they're all very similar. So you're looking at Drake London as a top target in the Cooper Cup kind of model, right? And then Tyler Higbee as an analog to Kyle Pitts. And Kyle Pitts' athleticism and his ability as a receiver is much, much higher. He's got a much higher ceiling than Higbee ever did, right? So when we're looking at that environment, you start smashing Falcons players, and don't sleep on Darnell Mooney.
The only thing I'd say is I don't see Pitts has a tight end title like Higbee, but he's really a wide receiver, and so that's why in particular, I see it more of Cup and Nakua to London and Pitts as opposed to versus Higbee. That's the only thing I'd say a little differently.
All right, we got another question right here.
I agree with someone said earlier about when you're starting team in the first 8 rounds. How soon should I start going for my second quarterback or maybe my third wide receiver? Should I start that in the 9th round, 10th round, or should I start looking at handcuffs?
Well, since I was the one that said that originally, I'll answer first. It depends on, for the quarterback situation, it depends on who I got at quarterback. Now, if I got one of the top tier guys, I'm going to wait a little bit longer because I'm probably never going to replace them other than a bye week or they get hurt. But I certainly have played quarterback chicken in some leagues, especially with the experts, and waiting too long. And now I'm like, oh, now I got to draft Kirk Cousins. Well, I like Kirk Cousins. He has been consistent in the past. But, you just don't have that warm, fuzzy feeling about it. So I might go then grab a Jared Goff, maybe 2 rounds later, as my backup, and I can now feel comfortable that when one of them are playing at home, they're very good at home. They're ridiculously consistent at home. On the road, neither one of them are very good. So you can kind of play that game. But then, like I said, if I drafted Patrick Mahomes or Jalen Hurts, yeah, I'm going to wait till later rounds for that. And then, as you talked about wide receivers, again, look at what you got as starters. If you are uncomfortable with your second running back, like yesterday I drafted J.K. Dobbins as my second running back because I got caught in a bad run. So now I'm like, okay, now I got to go find somebody a little bit sooner to draft because I don't know about Dobbins' health. So that's usually how I just kind of draft to how comfortable I feel about those positions and grabbing those backups earlier than the ones that are more set in stone, like a Mahomes or something like that. Make sense, guys?
So I'll hop into this one. I like to throw caution in the wind when it comes to these later picks. And I'm a big believer in streaming some of these positions, especially when you're coming to.
Yeah.
If you're in a 1 quarterback league, get your guy early. Get your Mahomes or whoever you're going to get. Take flyers in those later rounds. Get guys that there might be a situation where an injury happens in camp and they get a bigger role. But if that doesn't happen, you can drop that guy and you can get Gardner Minshew, Aiden O'Connell, some of these guys that they're not going to be great, but on a bye week you need a quarterback. You've got Patrick Mahomes. You can stream that position. It's better to take, in my opinion, take a flyer on a guy that could be in a situation where he could pop off, but he's going in that 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th round, and stream your backups for the bye weeks.
So Jaden Daniels is a guy that I've seen a lot of people do this with. They get a top tier person, but they grab Daniels later. Again, this kid has the potential. He could be the Anthony Richardson like last year that comes out and just explodes onto the field, and hopefully he doesn't get hurt. But what you can do with that player is, let's say they go off 3 or 4 weeks in a row, guess what happens? Hey, who wants this guy? Now you can go trade and improve your depth or your strength at your other positions for a guy that you drafted in round 14. So that's where you can use some of that to your advantage as well, is getting those high upside guys that might go off early, get rid of them early, because 2 bad games, people will have 0 interest after that. But definitely want to do that as well.
I think as far as like the roster building question, like you're asking when do you take a wide receiver 3, running back 2, you're answering that question with how you're drafting in the early rounds of your draft. Where you're investing the high-end equity of your team, you're drafting a team like you are drafting like you are right. Because if your first 2 out of your first 3 picks don't hit or they fall flat, your team might be screwed anyway. So you're drafting like you're right on paying up for quarterback. So if you're investing the high-end picks, like say the first 5 rounds of your draft, you go 3 wide receivers, a quarterback, a premium tight end, you don't have a lot of running backs. Now you're going to spray the board with as far as running backs. So how you're investing those early picks will dictate how the rest of your team is built. And I know that sounds like common sense, but if you're paying up for those positions like an early quarterback, 1 quarterback teams, if I'm paying up for Jalen Hurts, Anthony Richardson, one of the top 5, 6 guys, I might not even draft a QB2 because I'm making the bet that he is going to smash. I'm making the bet that he stays healthy and he's top 5. He is awesome. If that happens, then, and he doesn't hit, then I'll be probably streaming the rest of the year anyway. So I won't invest like take Richardson in the 5th and then take another quarterback in the 9th. That doesn't make any sense because you already paid up for that high-end quarterback. Well, then why are you paying up again? Why are you hedging against yourself? You did the research. You're making the bet that you're right. With the early picks, if they don't hit, you're going to be in trouble anyway. So just draft like you're right. Let those early picks dictate how the rest of your team is built.
People have mentioned looking at tiers. And when you're looking at tiers, what really you're looking at is the point differentials from one draft position to the next at a certain position. So when you're looking at quarterbacks do score the highest number of points every week in fantasy football, period. But if you're drafting the 12th quarterback off the board, the difference between the quarterback 5 and the quarterback 12 is going to be smaller than the difference between the running back 1 and the running back 6. So I tend to default to grabbing as many running backs and wide receivers in the first 6 or 7 picks, and then I'll start contemplating quarterbacks. But I know that if I am taking my first quarterback in the 9th or 10th round, sometimes the 11th, I can get somebody who's going to be scoring enough points where, since I've stacked so many high-end wide receivers, I'm going to be making up those point differentials. And I don't know if anybody here knows a quarterback. His name is Joe Flacco. He won people leagues last year. Or Folsom High School, shout out NorCal legend Jake Browning. How many people drafted Jake Browning last year? How many people won their league because they picked up Jake Browning off the waiver wire? So if you don't draft a second quarterback, you can drop your Van Jefferson flag plant for Jake Browning later on, and you're winning your league. That wasn't pointed at all.
I don't know. All right, we got a question here.
Hey, thank you. Dedrick from Tennessee, first time at the Expo, having a great time. I wanted to ask the question about the dreaded cliffs for wideouts and running backs. When are you off, guys? Because as a Titans fan, I'm a Henry guy. I'm scared as hell to draft him this year, but how do you apply that to players? And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I let the numbers do the talking. So, like, if I'm looking at guys and looking at tackle breaking metrics or yards per route run or other sticky statistics that show, like, how efficient guys are, I really let that do the talking for me. So, like, with him specifically, he's still top 12 in almost everything you look at as far as tackle breaking ability. So, he's an outlier. He's always been an outlier. I have no issue drafting him and paying up for him this year versus other guys where, like, Alvin Kamara specifically, he's been bottom 5, bottom 10 over the last 2 to 3 years. So some of that, I just let the numbers do the talking. How good is a player on a per route or per snap or per carry ability? And if he still has the juice, I'm willing to draft it based off of where they're going. Like, is that risk baked in? I have no problem in it.
Yeah, no, I'm all in Henry as well. I drafted him in both leagues yesterday in Kings Classic, both auction and snake, because I believe that this guy still has it. He's still a beast. He works out. He's just built differently, right? Adrian Peterson was that way. McCaffrey's that way. These guys are just built differently. And I think he's got a chip on his shoulder. I think Titans kind of let him walk, per se. But he was behind a horrible offensive line, bad quarterback situation, and still was that good. Now he goes to a team where you've got to worry about Lamar Jackson on every play. You've got one of the better offensive lines in the league. Like I said, I have him as on any team I can get him on. I'm getting him on. He's my running back one.
If you wound back the clock about, 5-7 years, everybody, to your point about the cliff, okay, once they hit age 26, age 27, it's like they got shot or something, they'd fall off. Technology has gotten so much better. The way they're taking care of the bodies, the less time that they're spending in OTAs and mini camps, they're taking so much better care of their bodies that the 28 is the new 26, for lack of a better term. So you start to see a little bit of a fall off as they're hitting 29 and 30, not the complete cliff, particularly for the stars. And so, I don't think you have to worry about it as much. And then you have the unique individuals like Derrick Henry and so forth. He's just, he's like an Adrian Peterson. He's just a weird beast, for lack of a better term. So
he's an alien.
He's an alien. That's well put, Bob. So, and same thing, wide receivers used to be 30 was the cliff, and now it's becoming more 32 is really, and you do see a much bigger drop off at 32. So I'd be avoiding the D Hopkins of the world this year.
Well, one of the things that doesn't get addressed a whole lot in analysis is that there's a lot of bleed from different platforms. So if you're talking Dynasty or Redraft or Best Ball, there's a lot of the narrative that you hear in the analyst space, and one of those things is the age cliff, and it means a whole lot more in Dynasty than it does in Redraft. And when you're looking at long-term ownership of a player, age plays a big factor. But we know from the data that elite players tend to outplay the age cliff. So somebody like Derrick Henry has a better chance at age 30, 31, 32 of continuing his elite performance and not falling off the cliff as fast. Whereas somebody who is 26, 27 as a running back that wasn't elite but is kind of doing okay might fall off a little bit quicker. So those elite guys, don't be afraid to take that chance. And Davante Adams is a perfect example of that. He's 32 years old as a wide receiver. Jerry Rice played till he was 40, and he was elite the entire time. The better a player is, the longer they can go into their age cliff. And Davante Adams got 170 targets last year. So even if they're old, they're still going to be producing at an elite level. And don't worry about it too much. If you're playing Dynasty, focus on that.
Out.
And also cancel out the noise in the narratives that are in the analysis, because depending on what format you're playing, it can make a big difference, and you need to kind of push those thoughts out.
All right, we got another question right here.
Hi, my name's Brad. I'm from around the area. I have kind of a crazy draft concept that I'm kind of messing with, and I want to get your guys' thoughts on it. So I call it the two top tight end tandem. So in a standard league where you have like two running backs, wide receiver, and one flex, I might draft Travis Kelce as an example, or Sam Laporta, and then not a round or two later, I might take Mark Andrews or another really top tier tight end to play in my flex, as opposed to maybe a mid-tier wide receiver running back I would fill that flex with. So I'm kind of trying to like get that as a draft tactic, I guess. I just kind of want your guys' thoughts on, is that even valid, or is it kind of crazy and no one should ever try that draft strategy ever? So
all right.
Okay.
Oh, go ahead.
He's not up here, and he's probably around here somewhere, but I want to give you the name Andrew Cooper, at Cooper Fiasco. So to steal from him, he has the yin and yang tight end system. And basically, he's drafting a top 5 tight end, period. That's it. I think RotoViz has like a bully tight end in best ball where they're taking at least 3 of the top 7 tight ends. So a heavy tight end draft can be very, very beneficial. But what you want is what you want to look at is what their proposed target rate is. And if they're getting 90 catches or 10 touchdowns, they're going to help you in that flex spot. And that's a shout out to Andrew Cooper.
I think it's still viable, but I would look at that strategy as a whole, depending on who's on the board. So looking at as you draft them, when you just go to the flex category and you could sort it by points per game. In previous seasons, Travis Kelce was producing as a top 5, like you compare him to wide receiver 5 points per game. So depending on how the draft is unfolding, and I think specifically this year, that top tier of like previous years, it was Kelce was a first round pick. He's a difference maker. There was only 2 to 3 elite level tight ends. This year, that math looks a little bit different possibly. So I think if you're approaching that, it depends on how you're comparing who's left on the board. If there's a value to be had in saying, look at Mark Andrews at his peak, 14.5 points per game, whatever it is off the top of my head. If that's the case, if he's a better pick and he's going to produce better than the wide receivers on the board, yes, it's totally fine. But I think to your point, with attacking it that way, if I was going to go that route, I honestly think I would wait for the last 2 guys at the top elite tier, like in the sense taking the value and making the bet on Pitts and Kittle still being elite, still outproducing wide receivers in that range, as opposed to paying up for Laporta and whoever the tight end 2 is off the board, because are they going to separate themselves if you stack them up versus those other players versus Kittle and Pitts, where they go and who's around them?
Isn't it awesome that we can actually talk about that now with the tight end room the way it is? You know,
And I mentioned that a little bit earlier, where you're kind of wanting to zig while others are zagging. So if that's a strategy that you think can approach it, I would suggest doing what Debro said, is stacking those two guys that are at the end of the tier so that you could still get a premier wide receiver a little bit earlier so that you can continue that, right? So if that's your strategy, then you're starting a run as well, where people are going to be backing, oh wait, there's already 2-3 tight ends off the board, I have to start this run now, and then those wide receivers are going to be coming back to you. That, you know, so that I like what he had said. And just to add to that,
Yeah, I agree with that too, especially with the fact that, like you said, the key is to focus on those tight ends. Don't look at the total points. Top 12 doesn't mean that 12th tight end is really going to help you that much. Focus on those guys that, again, have the consistency. David Njoku, Evan Ingram, Kittle, Jake Ferguson, those kind of guys. That's kind of that end of tier scenario. If you get Njoku and Ferguson, or those two, and wait a little bit longer, like he said, to get maybe a higher end receiver or running back up here, I think you're still bullying them by grabbing those two, because now you just panicked one of the other owners who knows they're not getting either one of them. Especially if you're on a turn and you can flip the turn with both tight ends, there'll be so many F-bombs dropped at that point in that room for the guys that don't have a tight end. It'll be uncanny.
I might be the contrarian on this one, but two things. One is first, it depends on your scoring system. Oftentimes when you get into those tight ends, when you're drafting them, there's more valuable wide receivers and running backs on the board. So I don't disagree with Bob that you'll get a few F-bombs, but you're really going to hurt one of the other 10 or 11 teams kind of thing, potentially at the end of the day. And at the end, whoever they end up picking, they're like, well, I don't want any of these tight ends, I'm going to grab a wide receiver running back. That wide receiver running back is highly likely to score more than that tight end when you start looking at it. A top 5 tight end does not correlate to a top wide receiver or a top running back and all. So that's the thing. So know your scoring system and what the points per game might be for that particular thing. So that's the first thing.
And I think the most important thing too is don't do this in your early rounds. I mean, we're talking like round 6, 7, 8, which at that point you're getting a marginal wide receiver 3 at best, especially if it's a typical draft, you're not going crazy with other positions. So definitely love that. Well, folks, we're out of time. Thank you so much. Give these guys a big round of applause.